Hello, everyone. Today we will delve into one of the darkest and most controversial pages of English history to examine the fate of a queen whose name became synonymous with cruelty, but whose life was full of personal tragedies. We will be talking about Mary I Tudor. Mary I Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland from 1553 to 1558. Her name, like a red-hot brand, is seared onto the pages of British history, leaving behind a trail of grim associations: the fires of the eye, Inquisition, religious fanaticism, unjustified cruelty. Her reign fell on a turbulent and pivotal threshold: the decline of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Travagna and contradiction-filled early modern period. She was the daughter of the powerful Henry VIII and the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon, a representative of the Tudor dynasty, which of course was not glorified by her, but by her half-sister, Elizabeth I the Great, daughter of Henry from his scandalous marriage to Anne Boleyn. Mary's reign did not end the Tudor story, but it took a staggering, almost suicidal zigzag, a sharp turn in a completely unexpected, archaic direction, as if trying to turn back the inexorable course of time. Her tragedy lay not only in personal misfortunes, but also in a profound misunderstanding of the historical forces that were already irreversibly changing the face of England and all of Europe. The fact is that for the Tudor dynasty as a whole, starting with its founder Henry VII and continuing with Henry VIII, especially during his reforms, and Elizabeth I, a pragmatic, though not always consistent, support for nascent bourgeois relations, the strengthening of national statehood, the encouragement of trade and navigation, and, especially importantly, the implementation of the Reformation, that is, the break with papal Rome and the establishment of the Anglican Church, was characteristic. This support was, as a rule, reasonable, devoid of extremes, at least ideally, and aimed at strengthening royal power and national unity. And, of course, an inevitable consequence of this course was the growing rivalry with Catholic Spain, the main bastion of the Counter-Reformation in Europe. Under Mary, however, everything went diametrically opposite. She, in essence, made a desperate, doomed attempt to stop time, to freeze England in the past, raising the banner of militant Counter-Reformation. In this, she resembled the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate, who ruled in the 4th century CE, who also vainly tried to restore paganism in an already deeply Christianized Roman Empire. Mary not only wanted to return England to the bosom of the Catholic Church, she strove to restore that model of relations between the Crown, the Church, and society that was already irrevocably receding into the past, ignoring at the same time the growth of national consciousness and the economic changes brought about by the Reformation. Such a policy, running counter to the main trends of historical development and the sentiments of a significant part of society, could only be attempted through direct, merciless violence. This is precisely how Mary acted, who forever entered history with the terrifying nickname Bloody Mary. And yet, initially, in her youth and at the moment of her accession to the throne, she was an object of national love and sympathy, even for a time a real idol as an unjustly persecuted, humiliated, and wronged princess. But the same people who so sincerely pitied her and rejoiced at her coronation later, faced with her religious terror, did not hesitate to call her bloody. This nickname appears in Protestant pamphlets and works of historians, such as John Foxe with his monumental Book of Martyrs, already during her lifetime or immediately after her death, becoming permanently attached to her. Foxe, himself a Protestant exile, collected detailed evidence of the persecutions, creating a powerful propaganda tool that defined the perception of Mary's reign for centuries. And her successor, Elizabeth I, had to expend considerable effort, tact, and political wisdom to cope with the severe consequences of this destructive policy, to heal the wounds inflicted on society, and to find a path to national reconciliation through the so-called Elizabethan settlement of church matters. Undoubtedly, for such strange, irrational, almost unnatural behavior of a monarch going against the interests of her own country and dynasty, there must have been very serious, deeply personal reasons. And the tragic, broken fate of Mary Tudor indeed explains much about her character and actions, though it does not justify them. Her life is a series of losses, humiliations, and disappointments that hardened her will but simultaneously made her suspicious, inflexible, and incapable of compromise. She was born on February 18, 1516, at the royal palace of Placentia in Greenwich, which was a favorite residence of the Tudors. Her father was the famous Henry VIII, who became king in 1509. Over the long years of his reign, almost 38 years, he changed beyond recognition. He ascended the throne young, educated, charming, and, it seemed, almost a humanist, who loved not only chivalric tournaments, hunting, and music. He himself composed poems and musical pieces, for example, the famous Pastime with Good Company, but also ancient literature and patronized scholars. The great Erasmus of Rotterdam, a friend and associate of Thomas More, wrote a laudatory ode in his honor and placed great hopes on him as an enlightened monarch. Henry made Thomas More, the author of Utopia, a man of the highest culture and moral principles, his first adviser, Lord Chancellor. And him, his friend and mentor, he ruthlessly executed in 1535 because, remaining loyal to the Catholic Church, he rejected the Royal Reformation and refused to recognize Henry as head of the Anglican Church. By the end of his life, Henry VIII had turned into a suspicious, cruel tyrant, suffering from obesity. It is known that his waist reached 137 centimeters, and numerous illnesses, such as gout, leg ulcers, possibly type 2, diabetes, or even syphilis, although historians dispute the latter, who sent not only 2 of his wives to the block or the gallows, but also many courtiers, priests, and common people. At the time of Mary's birth, King Henry VIII had already been married for 6 years and was eagerly, bordering on obsessively, awaiting the birth of a male heir. And an heir, according to the prevailing notions of the time, could only be a boy, a prince, capable in the future of firmly holding the reins of government and continuing the dynasty. At that time, no one could imagine the exceptionally important and glorious role that female reigns would play in the history of Great Britain. From Elizabeth I, the Great, who created England's Golden Age, and Queen Victoria, a symbol of the British Empire's power, to Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady of the 20th century. In medieval and early modern Europe, the conviction prevailed that women by their nature were weak, irrational, and not destined for power. Their place was at the domestic hearth. The transfer of the throne through the female line was considered an extreme and undesirable measure, fraught with dynastic disputes and civil wars. For example, the Wars of the Roses in 15th century England, the memory of which was still fresh. The very idea of a woman on the throne challenged the established order, based on patriarchal notions. Henry VIII's wife at that moment was Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish infanta, daughter of the famous Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. She was 6 years older than Henry, pious, educated, and initially loved by her husband and the people. And she did indeed give birth to boys, but only stillborn or dying in infancy. In 1510, she had a stillborn child, a girl. On January 1st, 1511, the long-awaited Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was born, but he died 52 days later. Then followed more miscarriages and stillborn children. After several such tragedies, culminating in a long, painful, and humiliating divorce process for the Queen, formally called an annulment of marriage, which she never recognized until the end of her life, signing herself Catherine, Queen of England. Her fate was sealed. This period, known as the King's Great Matter, lasted 6 years from 1527 to 1533 and led to tectonic shifts in English history. Henry's next wife, the ambitious and charming representative of the English court nobility, Anne Boleyn, for whom the king initiated the break with Rome, became the mother of Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I. But, failing to give the king a son, she also had miscarriages, was accused of high treason and adultery, including incest with her own brother and relations with other men, and beheaded in the Tower of London in 1536. Her fall was as swift as her rise. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, the king married Jane Seymour, a quiet and modest lady-in-waiting who finally, in 1537, gave him the long-awaited son, the future King Edward VI. However, Jane herself died of puerperal fever 12 days after giving birth. Henry VIII considered her his only true wife, as she had given him an heir, and was buried next to her in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. There was also Anne of Cleves, a German princess, whose marriage was arranged for political reasons by Thomas Cromwell to create an anti-Habsburg alliance. The king disliked her appearance so much, he allegedly called her a Flanders mare, that he annulled the marriage after 6 months, sending her away with a generous allowance and the title of the king's beloved sister. Anne of Cleves outlived both, Henry and all his wives, skillfully navigating court intrigues. Another wife, the young and frivolous Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin, was also executed in 1542 for adultery, which, unlike the accusations against Anne Boleyn, was proven. Henry, enraged and desperate, told everyone incredible stories about her cheating on him with hundreds of men, although in reality it concerned her premarital affairs and reckless behavior as queen. The king's last, 6th wife was Catherine Parr, twice widowed, an intelligent, educated, and tactful woman of Protestant sympathies. She was more of a nurse and companion to the aging, ailing, and increasingly despotic king than a passionate lover. Young, sweet, and meek, at least outwardly, she managed to create an atmosphere of relative peace in the family, persuading the old glutton and debauchee to calm down, show more mercy, and recognize his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, as full members of the royal family, restoring them to the line of succession, albeit after Edward, according to the Act of Succession of 1544. Perhaps he would have executed them too, if not for her mitigating and ennobling influence. Catherine Parr outlived Henry VIII, and after his death married Thomas Seymour, uncle of King Edward VI. Mary Tudor's mother, Catherine of Aragon, was the youngest daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the famous Catholic monarchs, unifiers of Spain, who completed the Reconquista with the expulsion of the Moors from Granada in 1492 and financed Columbus's expedition. Isabella was known for her fanatical, almost exalted religiosity. She became one of the initiators of the Spanish Inquisition. Ferdinand, on the other hand, was a more pragmatic politician, but also a zealous Catholic, and, according to rumors, fanatically greedy for money and power. Catherine's upbringing took place in an atmosphere of strictest Catholic piety, study of Latin, theology, courtly manners, and awareness of her high destiny as a Spanish infanta. She was a woman of great learning and strong character, which was evident in her long-standing resistance to Henry. At the age of 15, almost 16 in 1501, Catherine was brought to England and married to the 14-year-old Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, older brother of the future Henry VIII. This marriage was an important link in the anti-French policy of Henry VII Tudor, who sought to strengthen his newly acquired dynasty with international alliances. She was not at all supposed to become Queen of England by marrying Henry VIII. Her first husband, Prince Arthur, was a frail and sickly youth, and just 5 months after the wedding, in April 1502, died suddenly, probably of sweating sickness or tuberculosis at Ludlow Castle. The young widow Catherine found herself in a difficult position. Her incredibly stingy father, Ferdinand of Aragon, did not want to pay the remaining part of her dowry, which was 100,000 crowns, and Henry VII did not want to return the part already received and support her. For 7 years she lived in England in a kind of golden cage. Her fate was the subject of diplomatic bargaining. She wrote desperate letters to her father, complaining of need and uncertainty. To preserve the alliance with Spain and not return the dowry, Henry VII even considered marrying her himself after the death of his wife, Elizabeth of York. But this plan did not materialize. Then the idea arose of marrying her to his younger son, Henry. Henry VIII, having just become king in 1509 at the age of 17, almost immediately, on June 11th, to the surprise of many, married his brother's widow, Catherine, who was already 23 years old. This required a special papal dispensation, as marriage to a brother's wife was considered uncanonical according to the book of Leviticus. Catherine swore that her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated. That is, there had been no actual conjugal relations due to his illness, and therefore she had remained a virgin. Probably one of the main reasons for young Henry VIII's decision to marry Catherine was his intention to continue his father's policy of maintaining peace and alliance with Spain, which was gaining unprecedented strength. This country was a key part of the vast Habsburg Empire, which would soon be ruled by Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This empire united the Spanish kingdoms, the Low Countries, that is, the Netherlands and Belgium, part of Italy, including Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, German lands, possessions in Austria, and vast, ever-expanding colonies in the New World. As Charles V would later say, the sun never set on his empire. To become related to such a powerful royal house was very tempting for the young and ambitious English king, especially since Henry VIII, as his later life would show, treated matters of marriage with astonishing levity and cynicism, guided primarily by political, dynastic, and personal whims. Catherine was 6 years older than her husband. The first years of their marriage were apparently happy. The queen shared her husband's interests, participated in court life, even served as regent during his military campaigns in France in 1513, when the English won the Battle of the Spurs, and the Scots, allies of the French, were defeated at Flodden. After the tragic loss of 2 sons, born dead or dying shortly after birth, and a third who also did not survive, she, at 31, on February 18, 1516, gave birth to a healthy daughter, Mary. And although this was not the long-awaited male heir, the hope of having a prince still remained, and the girl was initially treated with great love and care. Her father, Henry VIII, was charmed by his little daughter, and called her the greatest pearl in the kingdom. She was indeed very beautiful in her childhood. Surviving portraits and descriptions by contemporaries depict a girl with abundant, golden-red hair inherited from the Tudors, fair skin, blue eyes, and regular features. She was slender, though not tall. She was dressed in luxurious velvet and silk dresses, adorned with precious stones, brought to court feasts and receptions, asked to dance or play musical instruments. She was a talented musician, played the virginals and lute before foreign ambassadors. Incidentally, it was their dispatches and records sent to their monarchs that preserved for us many details of her childhood and court life. She had everything a princess could dream of: luxurious apartments, balls, exquisite gowns, expensive toys, a retinue of servants. Her education was handled by the best tutors, including the Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives, who, at Catherine of Aragon's request, wrote a treatise for Mary on the education of a Christian woman. He emphasized the importance of studying classical languages, Holy Scripture, and the works of the Church Fathers, but also practical skills. Only the most important thing was missing: constant, deep, and warm attention from her parents. Henry VIII was absorbed in state affairs, hunting, tournaments, wars, for example, with France, and, of course, his numerous love affairs and amusements, which he loved very much. Catherine of Aragon, as she aged and lost hope of bearing a son, devoted more and more time to prayers and pious deeds. She worried greatly that, against the backdrop of her still young and energetic husband, she would not look old and unattractive, especially since he always had favorites, first less noticeable and then increasingly influential, such as Mary Boleyn and then her sister Anne. Little Mary was not just a child with whom her parents spent too little time, delegating her upbringing to nannies, governesses, and teachers. From birth, she became what can conditionally be called a dynastic commodity of the highest order. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, royal children, especially daughters, were seen not so much as individuals, but as a kind of valuable product that could be profitably sold or exchanged on the international political market, sealing a dynastic alliance, ensuring peace, or obtaining military support. From the age of 2 in 1518, serious negotiations began about her future marriage. Her first match was the French Dauphin, that is, the heir to the throne, Francis, son of King Francis I. The Treaty of London was even concluded, providing for this marriage as part of a comprehensive peace settlement in Europe, initiated by Cardinal Wolsey. Mary, who was only 2 years old, was officially betrothed to the Dauphin, who was a few months old. The balance of power in Europe in the first half of the 16th century was extremely complex and uncertain. The system of international relations, based on a balance of power, developed much later, only in the middle of the next 17th century, after the bloody 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. In the meantime, the situation remained extremely unstable, characterized by constant wars, shifting alliances, and intrigues. The papacy, once an all-powerful theocratic force, was gradually losing its influence, but still tried to play the role of arbiter and wove complex diplomatic intrigues. France, led by the ambitious Francis I, was embroiled in the protracted and ruinous Italian Wars, which lasted from 1494 to 1559, for hegemony in Italy, competing with the powerful Habsburg Empire, led by Charles V. The French king, Francis I, during one of these wars, after a crushing defeat at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, was even held captive by Charles V, and now sought to free himself from this humiliation and take revenge through new conquests and alliances. In these tangled contradictions and conflicts, friendship or alliance with England, which possessed considerable military and financial potential, could become a strong political trump card for any of the parties. Mary, as the only legitimate heir to the English throne at that time, albeit female, had a very high price on this marriage market. First, as already mentioned, she was betrothed to the French Dauphin, the future Henry II. This marriage, however, did not take place due to another change in Henry VIII's political course. In 1522, when England formed an alliance with Emperor Charles V against France, Mary, who was only 6 years old, was betrothed to Emperor Charles V himself, her first cousin, who was 16 years older than her. This marriage was supposed to take place when Mary reached the age of 12. Charles V, however, broke off this engagement in 1525 for political reasons. He needed an heir and a more advantageous match, marrying Isabella of Portugal. Later, when Mary's position deteriorated sharply after her parents' divorce and her declaration as illegitimate, less significant figures began to be proposed as her husbands, at most the Duke of Savoy or other minor European rulers. This series of failed engagements and humiliating bargaining for her hand could not but affect her self-esteem and attitude towards marriage. In 1518, Catherine of Aragon, still desperately trying to give the king an heir, had a stillborn girl. And in 1519, Henry VIII had an illegitimate but healthy and strong son by one of his numerous mistresses, the noble court lady Elizabeth, or Bessie Blount. He was given the beautiful and symbolic name Henry Fitzroy, meaning son of the king. Henry VIII adored this boy, gave him the titles of Duke of Richmond and Somerset, made him a Knight of the Garter and Lord High Admiral of England, considered declaring him his legitimate heir and even marrying him to his half-sister Mary, which would have been an unheard-of violation of canon law. Little Mary did not yet fully understand the mortal danger this boy posed to her future status and rights to the throne. Nothing prevented the king, especially one as self-willed as Henry VIII, from recognizing this child as legitimate if he wished, especially after he broke with Rome and became head of the church himself. Henry Fitzroy, however, died young in 1536 at the age of 17 of tuberculosis, never becoming king and relieving Mary of one of her potential rivals. But for now, in early childhood, Mary continued to live an outwardly beautiful and carefree life. She received a brilliant education for her time. She was taught Latin, Greek, French, music, namely playing the virginals, lute and clavichord, dancing, horse riding, and even falconry. She knew Latin excellently, spoke it fluently, and read classical authors. She recited Latin poems wonderfully, read and spoke Greek, though perhaps not as fluently as Latin, and knew French and Spanish, which was her mother's native language. She was keenly interested in ancient authors such as Plato, Cicero, and Seneca. But her young soul was even more drawn to the works of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, and the lives of the saints. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, personally supervised her religious upbringing, instilling in her a deep and unwavering devotion to the Catholic faith. Her confessors were Spanish priests. None of the English humanists of Erasmus's or Thomas More's circle, who initially surrounded Henry VIII, directly handled her religious education, but the influence of her deeply religious mother and her Spanish confessors was decisive. She grew up a devout, almost fanatical Catholic, deeply devoted to the papal see and traditional rites. This deep religiosity would become the core of her personality and determine many of her actions in the future. Meanwhile, a terrible, fateful shadow hung over her and her mother, Henry VIII. Despairing of obtaining a legitimate heir from Catherine and infatuated with the young and ambitious Anne Boleyn, who refused to be merely a royal mistress and demanded the crown, conceived the idea of divorcing, or rather annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Divorce from a Spanish infanta, a zealous Catholic, daughter of the most Christian kings, Isabella and Ferdinand, and especially importantly, the niece of the most powerful monarch in Europe, Emperor Charles V. This undertaking looked not just audacious but absolutely insane, fraught with war with Spain, papal excommunication, and complete international isolation for England. But Henry, incited by Anne Boleyn and his advisors, kto żądał sekularizacji cerkownych ziemiel, who craved the secularization of church lands, showed astonishing, almost maniacal persistence in this matter. The king's great matter became Henry's obsession. What really guided his actions? Of course, the desire to have a legitimate heir from a young wife, passion for Anne Boleyn, but not least, also a huge desire to profit from the untold wealth of the Catholic Church in England. It is known that monasteries owned almost a third of all land in the country, and to strengthen his absolute power by freeing himself from the dictates of papal Rome. In England, starting from the 13th century, monarchs repeatedly found themselves in significant financial and political dependence on the Roman See. For example, John Lackland, who after a conflict with Pope Innocent III was forced to recognize himself as a vassal of the Pope and pay him tribute. The fact that a large tribute, including annates and other levies, was paid annually from England to the Holy See caused simmering discontent and a wave of protests among both the nobility and the common people. As early as the late 14th century, the theologian John Wycliffe was active in England, sharply criticizing the wealth and power of the papacy, translating the Bible into English, and laying the foundations for the future Reformation. His followers, the Lollards, were cruelly persecuted, but the ideas of church reform did not disappear. When Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, he, as we remember, had to obtain a special permission, or dispensation, from Pope Julius II, along with a document confirming that her previous marriage to Prince Arthur had not been physically consummated and the bride had remained a virgin. Now, however, when Henry demanded that Pope Clement VII annul this very marriage on the grounds that it was allegedly uncanonical from the beginning, contradicting the biblical prohibition on marrying a brother's wife, as stated in the book of Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, although the book of Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, prescribed the opposite, namely levirate marriage. The Pope, who was under strong pressure from Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, whose troops in 1527 had sacked Rome during the so-called Sacco di Roma, was unwilling and unable to grant the king such permission. Negotiations with Rome, conducted by Cardinal Wolsey, reached a stalemate, which led to the fall and disgrace of the almighty cardinal. Enraged by the papal refusal and years of delays, Henry, under the influence of his new advisers, Thomas Cromwell, a master of political intrigue, and Thomas Cranmer, the future Archbishop of Canterbury, who sympathized with Protestantism, took a radical step. He declared that in England he himself was the supreme head of the Church, not the Pope of Rome. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, which officially proclaimed the king the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Even earlier, in 1533, Archbishop Cranmer, obedient to the king, annulled Henry's marriage to Catherine and recognized as legitimate his secret marriage to the already pregnant Anne Boleyn. They had secretly married in January 1533. Moreover, the marriage to Catherine was declared invalid from the beginning, and their daughter Mary, an illegitimate child, a bastard, deprived of rights to the throne. Thus, in 1533, Henry VIII finally divorced himself from his tiresome and barren, in terms of producing sons, wife. After this, Mary, who was already 17 and had previously been the sole legitimate heir to the English throne and bore the title of Princess of Wales, although it was not formally bestowed upon her, but she had her own court as heir. And this court was located at Ludlow on the border with Wales, was deprived of her status, title, court, and even the opportunity to see her mother. From 17 to 21, that is, until Anne Boleyn's death and the king's new marriage to Jane Seymour, she was the daughter of a hated, rejected, and divorced, from the king's point of view, wife, living in deep disgrace along with her mother. She was now officially referred to not as Princess Mary, but as Lady Mary, emphasizing her illegitimacy. And she was treated accordingly. She was moved to much worse conditions, to Hatfield House, where she was supposed to serve her newborn half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. She was deprived of her own court, her staff of servants was reduced to a minimum, and she was shown disrespect and humiliation in every possible way. She was required to recognize the illegitimacy of her parents' marriage and the king's supremacy over the church. But Mary, supported by her mother's letters and her deep faith, stubbornly refused, risking her father's wrath. Mary had every reason to fear not only for her future, but also for her life. Numerous arrests and executions of people displeasing to Henry VIII began in the country, primarily those who did not support his church reformation and the annulment of his marriage to Catherine. Bishop John Fisher of Rochester, who was also a cardinal, was executed. Former Lord Chancellor Thomas More was executed for refusing to swear an oath to the king as head of the Anglican Church and to recognize as legitimate his marriage to Anne Boleyn and the new order of succession. Thomas More did this knowing full well that he was condemning himself to an agonizing death. His execution, a man who enjoyed enormous respect throughout Europe, made a terrifying impression on his contemporaries. Shortly after receiving news of More's execution, Erasmus of Rotterdam, who loved and revered him as his closest friend and like-minded associate, also died. It was precisely at this terrible, humiliating, and dangerous moment that Mary, paradoxically, regained popular popularity and sympathy. Before, she had been a sweet, spoiled child, a pretty princess who danced for foreign ambassadors and played the virginals. Now, however, persecuted, deprived of everything, but with an unbroken spirit, loyal to her mother and her faith, she became a symbol of resistance to royal arbitrariness and injustice, an object of sympathy and secret hopes for many Englishmen, especially those who remained loyal to Catholicism. Catherine of Aragon, exiled to remote and damp castles like Buckton and Kimbleton, and deprived of communication with her daughter, they were only allowed to correspond, showed astonishing firmness, dignity, and unbending will in this tragic story. Until the end of her days, she died in January 1536, she signed herself Catherine, Queen, although she had long ceased to be officially considered queen. She was neither executed nor even formally imprisoned because she was a foreign princess of royal blood, and Henry feared the wrath of her powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V. But she was condemned to a miserable, humiliating existence in isolation, in damp and uncomfortable castles. The people sincerely pitied young Mary, rejected by her father and separated from her mother. Catherine of Aragon and Mary became a living banner for all opponents of the Reformation, for those who dreamed of a return to the old order and the restoration of the Catholic Church's power. Neighboring Scotland, where the Catholic Stuart dynasty ruled, as well as Ireland, where English influence was precarious, resisted Henry VIII's reforms with particular ferocity. Rebellions broke out in England itself. For example, the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 in the north of the country, directed against the dissolution of monasteries and church reforms, but it was brutally suppressed. And the Reformation in England, initiated from above by the king's will, took on extreme, often barbaric and most cruel forms in the 30s and 40s of the 16th century. The so-called secularization, and in fact, confiscation and plunder of monastic lands and property took place. Monasteries, which for centuries had been centers of learning, culture, education, and charity, were dissolved, monks and nuns expelled. Their vast landholdings and wealth passed into the king's hands and then were distributed or sold to the new noble aristocracy and gentry, which created a whole class of people materially interested in the irreversibility of the Reformation. Priceless works of church art, books, manuscripts, and relics were destroyed or sold off as remnants of popery. For example, in 1538, by order of Henry VIII, the famous tomb of St. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170 by order, or with the tacit consent, of King Henry II Plantagenet, was destroyed and plundered. This was one of the most revered pilgrimage sites in Christian Europe, where, according to tradition, miraculous healings had repeatedly occurred. And now, under the banner of church reform and the fight against Catholic prejudices and idolatry, with the knowledge and approval of Henry VIII, the saint's tomb was barbarically opened, plundered, all precious stones adorning it were gouged out, gold and silver offerings and precious fabrics were carried away, and the relics themselves, that is, the saint's bones, were publicly burned at the stake as the remains of a traitor. This sacrilegious act was committed on the basis of a special royal decree in which Henry VIII cynically proclaimed Thomas Becket, former Bishop of Canterbury, who by misunderstanding was proclaimed a saint by Roman authority, from this time forth is no longer so, and he should not be venerated, and his images should be removed from all churches. In 1536, as already mentioned, Henry VIII executed Anne Boleyn, and just 11 days after her execution, he entered into a new marriage with Jane Seymour. In October 1537, she finally gave him the long-awaited and only legitimate son, the future King Edward VI. The birth was very difficult and lasted several days. 12 days after the birth of her son, Jane Seymour died of postpartum infection, or childbed fever. Dark rumors spread throughout the country that during childbirth a dilemma arose: to save the life of the mother or the child, and the ruthless king allegedly ordered, "Save only the heir, even if it means cutting up the queen." The reliability of these rumors is doubtful, but they reflected the general perception of the king's cruelty. 21-year-old Mary, whose position at court had somewhat improved after the death of Anne Boleyn, who hated and humiliated her in every way, and under pressure from the new Queen Jane Seymour, who sympathized with her, was appointed godmother to her newborn half-brother, Prince Edward. This was a kind of favor from her father, a sign of some reconciliation. But for this, Mary had to take a humiliating step. Under pressure and threats from Thomas Cromwell, she was forced to acknowledge in writing the king's supremacy over the church and the illegitimacy of her parents' marriage, that is, her own illegitimacy. This was a most severe moral compromise for her, which she probably regretted for the rest of her life. But now she had practically no real hopes of regaining her status as the main heir to the throne. In accordance with the new Act of Succession, passed in 1536, Mary and Elizabeth were still considered illegitimate, but could inherit the throne in the absence of legitimate heirs from Edward. Mary's position remained very difficult and ambiguous. She was between warring parents, although her mother had already died. Her shadow and her tragedy continued to influence Mary, between two warring religious confessions, Catholicism, to which she was fanatically devoted, and Anglicanism imposed from above. In fact, between two Englands, one of which, the official courtly one, had accepted or pretended to accept the Reformation, while the other, a significant part of the people, especially in the northern and western counties, remained in their hearts loyal to the old Catholic faith. And finally, between two countries, England, her homeland, and Spain, her mother's homeland, where she had powerful relatives, including Emperor Charles V, her first cousin, who wrote her letters, expressed sympathy, and tried to support her morally and materially. Charles V, as the main defender of Catholicism in Europe, was ready at any moment to use the situation in England for his own interests and, under certain circumstances, even to move his huge land and sea forces against England. Meanwhile, despite her precarious position, bargaining continued on the dynastic marriage market. Henry VIII, in need of allies, repeatedly offered the hand of his disgraced but still royal daughter to various European monarchs or their heirs. After the failure of marriage plans with the French Dauphin and Emperor Charles V, she was betrothed to King James V of Scotland, but he preferred French princesses. Then Henry VIII turned again to an alliance with the Habsburgs, and at some point Mary once again became the supposed bride of one of their extensive kin, possibly Philip, son of Charles V, who would later become her husband, but he was still a child then. As a child, she, according to tradition, even sent Charles V a ring as a sign of her devotion, which he laughingly put on his little finger and said, "Well, I will wear it in her memory." Later, when her status declined even further, some German Protestant prince was proposed as her suitor, for example, the Duke of Cleves, brother of Anne of Cleves, or Philip of Bavaria, which was completely unacceptable to her, a zealous Catholic. The candidacies of Portuguese infantas, the Duke of Orleans, younger son of Francis I, and even some rulers of southeastern Europe were considered. This meant a clear decline in her dynastic status. In the worst times, when her position was particularly desperate, there were rumors that Mary might be married off to some insignificant Irish chieftain, or even to an English aristocrat, to definitively deprive her of her rights to the throne. Then, as the political situation changed, the candidacy of a French prince, the Duke of Angoulême, resurfaced. Mary lived all this time as if in a shop window, put up for sale. Her feelings and desires interested no one. This series of humiliating and uncertain marriage negotiations undoubtedly left a deep mark on her soul, strengthening her natural suspicion, reticence, and sense of uselessness. In 1547, Henry VIII died, and his 9-year-old son, Mary's half-brother, Edward VI, became king. In accordance with the last Act of Succession of 1544 and Henry VIII's will, Mary's as well as Elizabeth's position at court was officially restored. They were recognized as heirs to the throne after Edward and his descendants. Mary received a significant allowance, her own estates, including Kenninghall and Framlingham castles, and the right to the title Lady Mary, the King's sister. She became second in line to the throne after Edward, but she still had no real political prospects. Power in the country belonged to a regency council, first headed by the Duke of Somerset, the king's uncle, and then by the Duke of Northumberland, who pursued an increasingly radical Protestant policy, introducing Anglican worship in English, the Book of Common Prayer, and abolishing many Catholic rites, nor a personal life. She remained unmarried, her age approaching 30, which in those days was considered almost old age for a woman wishing to marry and have children. Religious questions increasingly occupied her. Her long-standing inner loneliness, her broken and tragic fate, constant humiliations and fears took their toll. She found solace only in strict observance of Catholic rites, in long prayers, and in reading religious literature. She demonstratively refused to attend Anglican services and demanded the right to celebrate Mass in her chapels, which led to her constant and sharp conflicts with the young King Edward, who was a fanatical and intolerant Protestant brought up in this spirit by his tutors and his all-powerful advisers. Edward even threatened her with imprisonment. Only the intervention of her cousin, Emperor Charles V, who threatened England with war if Mary's right to private worship was violated, somewhat eased the situation. And for the remnants of the Catholic clergy in England, and for all those dissatisfied with the Reformation, she remained the main symbol and hope of a future counter-Reformation. She was perfectly suited for this role, the persecuted and humiliated daughter of a Catholic martyr queen, living in constant prayer, an unbending and faithful Catholic. Moreover, she was the granddaughter of the most Catholic Western European kings, Ferdinand and Isabella. In England at that time, there were many who looked back with longing and regret and would have dreamed of returning to yesterday. To a time when there was no destructive Reformation, confiscation of church lands, dissolution of monasteries, which, for centuries, had been centers of culture, education, and charity. To a time when there was no nascent early capitalism with its cruel enclosures of common lands, mass impoverishment of the peasantry, their transformation into vagrants and beggars, and the painful breakdown of familiar feudal relations and traditional way of life. For even today, in the 21st century, it is not uncommon to meet people who nostalgically idealize the past and assert that only in that irretrievably lost world would they have been truly well and calm. We do not know for sure how consciously and calculatingly Mary, during Edward VI's reign, played the role of inspirer and leader of the Catholic opposition. Most likely, there was no active politicking or conspiratorial activity in her behavior. She simply firmly and openly defended her right to profess the Catholic faith, refused to attend Anglican services, and accept the new Protestant doctrine which led to her constant conflicts with King Edward and his advisers. Her home became a center of attraction for all those dissatisfied with the Protestant reforms. Edward VI, a sickly and weak youth, probably suffering from tuberculosis, died very early, on July 6, 1553, at the age of only 15, leaving no heirs. Thus, completely unexpectedly for many, 37-year-old Mary once again became the real and legitimate heir to the English throne in accordance with her father's will. However, the powerful Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, the de facto ruler of England under Edward VI, fearing for his power and life in the event of the Catholic Mary's accession, tried to prevent her and staged a coup d'etat. He persuaded the dying Edward VI to change the order of succession in favor of the young Lady Jane Grey, great-granddaughter of Henry VII, namely granddaughter of his younger sister, Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and wife of Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley. Jane Grey was a Protestant, an intelligent and educated girl, and Northumberland hoped to rule in her name. For 9 days, from July 10th to July 19th, 1553, England had a 9-day queen. But the people did not support this illegal decision and usurpation of power. Londoners and inhabitants of many other counties ardently defended Mary, the legitimate heir, a devout, though stern, unmarried woman who had hitherto given no grounds for any bad rumors about her moral character. Her tragic fate and steadfastness aroused sympathy. Mary, learning of Northumberland's plans, fled to her estates in East Anglia, where she gathered loyal supporters around her. After several days of popular unrest and the defection of the army and navy, as well as most members of the Privy Council, to Mary's side, Northumberland was arrested, and Mary Tudor, on August 3, 1553, triumphantly entered London and was proclaimed Queen of England. The specter of the crown, which had seemed long since to have vanished in the mists of the past, suddenly became a reality. And she immediately, with fierce determination, took revenge for all the long years of persecution, humiliation, and suffering. Arrests and executions began at once. The Duke of Northumberland and his closest supporters were executed. Later, after the suppression of Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger's rebellion in January-February 1554, a rebellion directed against Mary's marriage plans with Philip of Spain and aimed at placing Elizabeth on the throne. Numerous Greys were also executed. Not only the unfortunate 16-year-old Jane Grey, a puppet in the hands of ambitious politicians, but also her husband Guildford Dudley and her father, the Duke of Suffolk. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury, one of the main ideologues of the English Reformation, a widely educated man, a talented writer and theologian, comparable in intellectual level to Thomas More, but who found himself on the opposite side of the religious conflict, was arrested and then, in 1556, burned at the stake. Fires blazed daily throughout the country, burning heretic Protestants, bishops, such as Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, burned at Oxford, priests, common laymen, men and women. In her religious cruelty, Mary perhaps did not surpass her father, Henry VIII, who also executed many people for religious and political motives. But her persecutions were more systematic, targeted, and left a much darker mark on popular memory, as they were associated with foreign Spanish influence and an attempt at a forcible return to papal authority. Queen Mary, having established herself on the throne, decided that her husband could only be one man in the world, her second cousin, who was the son of her cousin Charles V, Infante Philip of Spain, the future King Philip II. By that time, in 1554, he was 26 years old. She was already 38. The age difference was significant, but this did not bother Mary. Philip was for her not just a young and attractive man of royal blood, although in reality he was not handsome, but gloomy and cold. He was, like herself, a convinced and fanatical Catholic who had already managed to become the banner of the European Counter-Reformation, leading a merciless struggle against Calvinism and other forms of Protestantism that were rapidly spreading in Europe, especially in the Low Countries or Netherlands, which were part of his domains. In the Netherlands, Philip, who constantly demonstrated his unity with the Inquisition and established there the bloody regime of the Duke of Alba, eventually came to be regarded as a real monster and tyrant. The marriage contract was carefully drafted. Philip received the title of King of England, but had no right to interfere in the country's governance, appoint foreigners to positions, and in the event of Mary's death without heirs, he had no rights to the English throne. England was also not to be drawn into Spain's wars. However, these guarantees did little to reassure the English. As is known, the husband of a reigning queen in England does not automatically become king. His title is Prince Consort, that is, husband prince, and he has no independent rights to the throne or governance of the country. But even despite this limitation, the very appearance in the kingdom of such an odious and powerful foreign figure as the heir to the Spanish crown aroused deep fears and protests among most Englishmen, especially Protestants and patriotically minded. Nobility? They feared that England would become an appendage of Spain, be drawn into alien Spanish wars, and lose its independence. And Mary, moreover, emphasized in every way that her decision to marry Philip was not only a political calculation, but also the dictate of her heart, her soul. She was, apparently, sincerely, and unrequitedly in love with her young and gloomy chosen one. The wedding of Mary Tudor and Philip of Spain took place on July 25, 1554, at Winchester Cathedral. For most thinking people in England, it was a black day, portending new troubles and suffering. But Mary seemed to be at the height of happiness. Her young husband, whom she had seen for the first time only a few days before the wedding, seemed to her a real handsome man and a knight, although his surviving portraits, for example, by Titian or Antonis More, clearly say otherwise. He was short, with a protruding lower lip, which was a Habsburg family trait, a pale face and cold, expressionless eyes. Lavish court feasts, balls, and tournaments began. Mary, who had lived for so many years in humiliation and oblivion, desperately wanted to make up for lost time, to feel loved, desired, and an all-powerful queen. But many problems arose with this marriage, and very soon Philip arrived in England with a large and arrogant Spanish retinue. It turned out that the Spanish aristocracy, with its stiffness, pride, and contempt for everything non-Spanish, was poorly compatible with the more freedom-loving and independent English nobility. They even dressed completely differently. For the Spanish, strict dark suits and high, heavily starched ruffs or frills were in fashion, which did not allow one to lower one's head and gave a person an arrogant, frozen appearance. The English, accustomed to more comfortable and colorful clothing, wrote with resentment and indignation about the Spanish in their diaries and letters. "They behave as if we were all their servants and slaves." Constant conflicts, skirmishes, and quarrels began. At court, it often came to duels and fights between English and Spanish courtiers. Each such incident required a judicial investigation, and often someone was punished or even executed. And executions during Mary's reign were indeed generous and without much investigation, especially if it concerned heresy or high treason. Philip behaved at the English court outwardly correctly and secularly, participated in entertainments, but remained cold and aloof. He knew English poorly, although he tried to learn it, despised English customs, and found English food disgusting. He did not hide his impatient desire to leave this barbaric and heretical country as soon as possible. However, he ardently and consistently supported his wife, Mary's bloody religious policy. He even brought with him from Spain several experienced inquisitors and theologians, such as Bartolomé de Carranza, who helped English bishops, among whom were Edmund Bonner, Bishop of London, known as Bloody Bonner, and Stephen Gardiner, bishops of Winchester and Lord Chancellor, to conduct trials of heretic Protestants. The procedure of burning at the stake, considered in Catholic Europe as the traditional punishment for persistent heresy, became an almost daily occurrence in Mary Tudor's England. During the 5 years of her reign, about 300 people were burned, according to some data 284, including 56 women. Philip, it seems, was already then in England, preparing for the nightmare of religious terror that he would unleash in his Netherlandish possessions in the 1560s. In England, during the Reformation of Henry VIII, and especially Edward VI, the Catholic clergy were expelled from parishes, deprived of property and rank. Many priests were forced to emigrate, others hid, secretly performing services. About 3,000 Catholic priests remained, who found refuge in abandoned, dilapidated rural churches, in the ruins of former monasteries, or in the homes of loyal Catholic laypeople. They were hunted down and expelled from the country, or subjected to punishment. Several hundred of those, considered particularly active and dangerous preachers of Catholicism, were executed under Henry VIII and Edward VI. Now, however, under Mary and Philip, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction, and cruel repressions began against those who had accepted Protestantism and refused to return to the bosom of the Catholic Church. Medieval laws against heretics were restored. Parliament, albeit reluctantly, repealed the Reformation legislation of Henry VIII and Edward VI, and restored papal jurisdiction over England, though without returning confiscated lands to the Church, which became a key compromise. The unfortunate country, barely recovered from one round of religious persecution, found itself in the grip of a new, even more terrible religious fanaticism. Thousands of Protestants, fearing for their lives, were forced to emigrate to Protestant countries on the continent: Germany, Switzerland, especially Geneva, and Zurich, and France. These exiles were called Marian exiles, and they played an important role in spreading radical Protestant ideas, returning to England under Elizabeth I. The persecuted Protestants, going to a martyr's death, began to arouse increasing sympathy and respect among the people. Just as Mary herself, in the years of her persecution, had been an object of universal ardent sympathy, now this place was taken by her enemies, the Protestant martyrs. During public executions, many of them, though not all, showed exceptional courage, steadfastness, and loyalty to their beliefs. If at first under torture or in hope of pardon, some of them repented of heresy, as was required of them, and asked for forgiveness. Then, in the face of an imminent and agonizing death at the stake, they often changed their behavior, renounced their recantations, and died with a prayer on their lips, glorifying God and condemning their executioners. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, broken by long imprisonment and threats, also initially recanted Protestantism in writing. But when he was brought to the stake in Oxford on March 21, 1556, he unexpectedly and courageously declared to everyone, "And as for my hand, which wrote what was contrary to my heart, it shall be punished first. For if I come to the fire, it shall be burned first." And he indeed held his right hand in the flames until it was charred, before the fire engulfed his entire body. The people, witnessing this terrible and majestic scene, were shocked by the courage of these men. The attitude towards Queen Mary, on the contrary, grew worse and worse, for no one expected from her, once a universally loved and pitied princess, either such outrageous cruelty or such a dominance of hated foreign Spaniards at court. Another important and tragicomic incident occurred, which finally undermined the Queen's authority. In 1554, shortly after the wedding, it was solemnly announced to the people that Queen Mary was expecting an heir from Philip of Spain. This was extremely important news, which would have meant the continuation of the Catholic dynasty on the English throne and the strengthening of the alliance with Spain. But for many, it also meant a new, even greater danger. Philip, having become the father of the heir to the English crown, might have tried to get himself recognized as co-ruler of England, or even regent in the event of Mary's death. However, the news of the Queen's pregnancy turned out to be false. Mary had a so-called false or phantom pregnancy, medically pseudocyesis, a rare psychosomatic condition in which a woman exhibits all the signs of pregnancy, including cessation of menstruation, abdominal enlargement, nausea, and even the sensation of fetal movement, but there is actually no fetus. Perhaps Mary herself, desperately wanting to have a child and please her husband, believed so strongly in her pregnancy that her body responded in this way. Or perhaps it was partly also a conscious political game, an attempt to raise her prestige, strengthen her husband's position, and reverse hostile public opinion. Official notifications of the birth of a prince were even printed. People tend to believe that a woman with an impending or actual birth of a child becomes softer, kinder, more merciful. And the Queen's husband, Philip, so unloved by the English, tired of joyless court entertainments, lack of real power, and probably disappointed in his not young and unattractive wife, sailed to Spain in August 1555 to receive from his father Charles V the rule of the Netherlands, and then of the entire Spanish Empire. The subjects were supposed to believe that now, with the Queen expecting a child and the hated Spaniard gone, everything in the country would improve and be well. It is understandable that the rumor of the imminent birth of a royal infant is difficult to maintain for more than 9 or 10 months. Mary, however, managed to hold out in a state of feigned pregnancy for almost 11 or 12 months. Medicine of that era, of course, was not distinguished by accuracy, and diagnosis was based on external signs and the woman's own sensations. But in the end, in the summer of 1555, it had to be admitted with bitterness and humiliation that a mistake had been made, and there was no pregnancy. This was a terrible blow to Mary's prestige, making her a laughingstock throughout Europe. This happened just as her father, Emperor Charles V, in 1555 and 56, began the process of abdicating his numerous thrones, and Philip became first ruler of the Netherlands, and then, in January 1556, King of Spain, known as Philip II, as well as of Naples, Sicily, and possessor of vast overseas colonies. He received half of the global Habsburg Empire and was preparing to continue the fight against Protestantism and France for hegemony in Europe with even greater energy. Philip returned to England briefly only in 1557, from March to July, mainly to draw the country into war with France. In 1558, Mary had a second false pregnancy, which ended in similar disappointment and even greater deterioration of her physical and mental health. To support her absent and increasingly indifferent husband in his imperial ambitions, Mary, against the interests of England and the opinion of most of her advisers, including those who had previously supported her Catholic policy, entered into war with France on Spain's side in 1557. An ill-conceived, poorly prepared, and unpopular war began, for which England was completely unprepared financially, morally, or militarily. English troops were sent to the continent to support the Spanish. The result of this adventure was the humiliating loss in January 1558 of the port of Calais, the last English possession on the continent, the so-called gateway to France, which had belonged to England for over 200 years. Since the 100 Years' War, the French, under the command of Duke Francis of Guise, suddenly attacked and captured Calais, whose garrison was weakened and unprepared for defense. The loss of Calais was perceived in England as a national disgrace and catastrophe, a symbol of the decline of English influence and government incompetence. Mary's tragic words, spoken shortly before her death, are well known. "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." This statement, even if not a literal quote, accurately reflects the depth of her personal grief and political failure. Her entire life, her reign, were, in essence, one great tragic failure. She could not bear an heir. She could not return England to the bosom of the Catholic Church. On the contrary, her cruelty only strengthened anti-Catholic sentiments and sympathy for Protestantism, preparing the ground for a more lasting Elizabethan settlement. She could not win the love of her husband or her people. The people began to call her bloody even during her lifetime, and all their hopes for the future the English increasingly placed on another princess, the young, intelligent, educated, and most importantly, Protestant, though moderate, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. As it later turned out, not in vain. Being by nature much more intelligent, far-sighted, and politically flexible than her fanatical sister, Elizabeth saw Mary's terrible mistakes, desperately trying to turn history protein back with brute force and violence. Elizabeth, whom Mary suspected of sympathizing with Protestants and participating in conspiracies, especially during Wyatt's rebellion. After this rebellion, Elizabeth was even imprisoned in the Tower for a time, and then kept under house arrest at Yea, Woodstock, and Hatfield, behaved very cautiously during her sister's reign, outwardly demonstrating loyalty and even attending Catholic masses. She avoided open conflicts, showed tact and restraint, and therefore survived, although her life often hung by a thread. Philip of Spain, strangely enough, even acted as her protector, fearing that in the event of her death, the heir would be Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots and claimant to the English throne, closely linked to France, Spain's main enemy. And after Mary Tudor's death from illness, probably ovarian or uterine cancer, or influenza complicated by dropsy. On November 17, 1558, Elizabeth I, at the age of 25, ascended the English throne, met with universal rejoicing. She became one of the greatest and most beloved rulers in English history, opening a new, glorious page in its destiny, known as the Elizabethan era. And Bloody Mary remained forever in the memory of posterity as a grim symbol of religious fanaticism, a failed revanche, and a tragically misunderstood, deeply unhappy woman whose life was crippled by her father's cruelty, political intrigues, and her own demons. Her attempt to restore Catholicism proved not only cruel but also counterproductive, only strengthening Protestantism in the hearts of the English and preparing the ground for a more moderate and lasting religious settlement under her sister.